Hey team. So today I'd like to talk about the effects of the Russo-Japanese War. And I think the Russo-Japanese War is an especially useful war to consider the effects on, in some sense, because it has fewer participants than some of the other wars that you might study, but also because I think those effects fit really neatly into some political effects, some economic effects, some social effects. And I'm also going to consider some effects that these have on strategy. One thing that is perhaps not unique, but nearly unique about the Russo-Japanese War is that we'll be able to consider the impacts on the winner, Japan, on the loser, Russia, but also on a third party, which is China and Manchuria itself. So I think that will give you a really interesting triangle to consider as you compare and contrast the effects of this war with perhaps another war of your choosing to give yourself that three-dimensional depth that can really help us understand historical processes. I think that the most obvious impacts of the war come from the treaties, and so for China, even though the treaties seem to remove Russia from a large part of Manchuria and give the railway over to Japan, in practice, there's increased foreign control over Manchuria. Japan will have de facto control over Korea, which will become de jure control over Korea by 1910. And the Qing dynasty itself is not able to take advantage of any power vacuum in Manchuria, if any exists at all. In fact, the Qing dynasty is on its last legs, independent of the Russo-Japanese War. There are lots of other things that are destabilizing centralized power in China. Certainly, foreign intervention and imperialism is one of them. But the Russo-Japanese War is just one factor in the increased weakening of the Qing dynasty. For Japan, I think we have an interesting dichotomy here. Internationally, prestige shoots up. It's a huge boon for Japan. This is the first time that a non-Western power has defeated a Western power, certainly in centuries. And at the same time, the peace is probably destabilizing at home. The Treaty of Portsmouth without an indemnity is unpopular among the Japanese people themselves. And this is probably a casualty of war propaganda. The Japanese citizens probably believed that they won the war by a wider margin than in fact they did. And so, in that sense, then the Japanese government and the Japanese ruling class is a victim of its own successfully promoted nationalism, which leads its citizens to ultimately be dissatisfied with the war. And let's just remember, this is now the second war in a row that Japan can be dissatisfied with. The first Sino-Japanese War was marred by the triple intervention afterwards, and now this feels like an incomplete victory. Even though, from our historical perspective, we can confidently say that the Treaty of Portsmouth was probably just about the best that Japan could have possibly done. This increased unrest is going to lead to increased importance of political parties in Japan. And really from the end of the Russo-Japanese War through until the ascension of Hirohito in the mid-1920s, this is going to be the time in Japan's post-Meiji, but pre-1951 history, where party politics is going to be most important. And so the significance of those parties is going to rise. In Russia, the reactions, especially politically, start even before the war is over, with Bloody Sunday and the Revolution of 1905. Revolution is probably too strong a word, but that is what we usually call that. That leads to initial repression, but then ultimately the October Manifesto by the Tsar in 1905, which grants these fundamental rights. And we have some basic rights of citizenship, and it creates a Duma, which will be sort of the Russian equivalent of a parliament. Internationally, Russia is, of course, weakened, and this is going to lead it to, on the one hand, accept some conditions with other great powers, for example, the Anglo-Russian Entente, which solves some disagreements about the Middle East. And Also, it will lead, in terms of Russian strategy, for a turn from expansion in the East to expansion in the West. And the importance of Eastern Europe and of Central Europe is going to grow in Russian strategic thinking. The significance of railroads was greatly demonstrated to the Russian strategists with the incompletion of the Trans-Siberian Railway not being fully double-tracked at the beginning of the war. This leads to a huge surge of railroad investment in Western Europe as their strategic eyes turn towards that. Essentially, then, they're going to be forced to accept the status quo in the East while they plan for expansion to Russia's west. But even that expansion is going to be delayed by the obvious weakness which comes out of the war. Japan is also going to be able to shift their ambitions towards more continental ambitions. Korea is the most obvious place here, and in fact, if you wanted to go outside the scope of this video, a very interesting investigation would be to look at the impact of the Russo-Japanese War on Korea and on Korean citizens, because Japan is going to exert quite a lot more control over Korea immediately after the war, and then increasingly as Korea becomes a Japanese colony in the subsequent decades. In terms of their strategy, this validates an offensive strategy rather than a defensive strategy, and it is going to validate the high-risk, high-reward move of things like the Battle of Tsushima, for example. And so we will actually see, I would argue, the echoes of the Russo-Japanese War's successful strategy even during the Second World War, where the surprise attack on Port Arthur is echoed by the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and the all-or-nothing naval battle of Tsushima is echoed by the Battle of Midway. And so that can give you some continuity when you move forward and study the Second World War. Korea obviously is going to be the staging ground, and in fact, as the next conflict that Japan gets into will be the First World War, which isn't instigated by Japan, but Japan will use its military in 1931 around which is only possible because of the support in Korea to launch the Manchurian incident. In China, the Qing dynasty is going to see the benefits of modernization. There's an attempt to modernize the military, but really, strategically, the dynasty is still forced to try to play great powers off against each other in some sort of a tactic to find some space. This is not going to be successful, and the Qing dynasty is not going to survive. But that also, again, has as much to do with domestic problems as it does with foreign problems. Economically, we have the interesting dichotomy in Manchuria, where there's a surge of foreign capital, especially Japanese capital and investment, over the course of the next 20 to 25 years. Manchuria is going to become by far the most industrialized area of China, but that comes at the cost of a loss of national control. And most of this development is going to be financed by Russia in the north and really a lot by Japan in the south. And so the increased GDP of Manchuria is not reflected in an increase necessarily in the standard of living of the Chinese citizens who are living in Manchuria, even though there is some large-scale migration of Chinese from outside of Manchuria in. And when we think about some of the ethnic groups, Manchuria is called Manchuria because it's been dominated by the Manchu people historically. But this is the beginning of a huge migration of the Han Chinese into Manchuria. And, well, not the beginning, but a multiplication of that. And this leads to more rapid industrialization of the cities. But it's important just to remember that this development is largely exploitative and extractive. Um, and the lessons that Chinese citizens take tends to be drawn from the successes of Japan and from the impressiveness of the Japanese victory. And so Chinese nationalism is going to seek a Chinese version of Japan's Meiji Restoration. Figures like Sun Yat-sen become really important in that move. And this, of course, rebounds back for after the First World War with movements like the May 4th movement and things like that. Japan finishes the war nearly bankrupt. It has financed the war through heavy foreign loans, mainly from British and American banks, and through greatly increased taxation. And servicing this debt requires the extension of some of these loans, but also the maintenance of these really high levels of wartime taxation. And it's a lot easier to justify high levels of taxation when men are fighting and dying on the battlefield. It's increasingly difficult to do this after the war, especially when you're not able to secure an indemnity, war payments, or war reparations, we might call them, after the First World War. Heavy industry in Japan has been really, really benefited by the war. There's been a big increase, obviously, in the military industrial capacity. But a lot of this economic growth has not really passed itself on to normal citizens because much of the promotion and payment of the debt has been done through high levels of taxation. Korea and Manchuria are, of course, providing raw materials to an increased degree, and the area for the investment of any excess capital which is generated. But this growth, which comes from imperial expansion, is very uneven. And wealth inequality in Japan increases during this time, which again is going to set the stage for this increased significance of political parties and mass movements, and for the obviously clear, focused government efforts to stamp out socialism. And a fear of socialism is really, really evident after the war. And this will, of course, be ratcheted up after the First World War, and the Bolshevik Revolution makes that more real and more scary. But this unrest, which we can see in things like the Hibiya riots in protest of the Treaty of Portsmouth, and things like the People's Rights Movement, which try to expand the democratic aspects of the Meiji Constitution, definitely point towards a possibly evolving social structure. A lot of this is ultimately suppressed, and this celebration of the militarization of Japanese society probably masks more social unrest and inequality than is obvious at the surface. And this is also true in Russia. Russia is going to balance this increased focus on a constitutional monarchy through the October Manifesto with greatly increased repression. And the defeat of the centralized power leads to an increase in minority nationalistic movements in places like Poland, for example, and then also to really increased repression. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are sent to Poland to put down any possible unrest, and then there are some terrible anti-Jewish pogroms in cities like Odessa, for example, and this is simultaneously successful repression in that none of these movements pose a threat to the Tsar, but at the same time probably create more discontent, which is going to, I guess we could say, wait for a spark. And of course, that spark is going to be the disaster of the First World War for Russia. Russia's huge war debt is only able to be financed through increase in foreign loans from French banks, and also British banks join in. These loans, which actually are signed just before the Duma sits, do give Russia some breathing room, but they greatly undermine the power of the Duma, because its big power is the power of taxation and of revenue gathering. And this huge loan means that that won't be as important. So the Duma won't have as much leverage against the Tsar. So these loans are almost anti-democratic in their effect. There is lots of investment again in the West. This is going to spur increased economic growth. That should be good for the country. There are land reforms which increase the ease and access to property ownership of Russian peasants. But and in fact, the government subsidizes movement of these of Russian peasants east of the Ural Mountains out into areas like Siberia. And this reduces land pressure and probably improves the quality of life of peasants, especially peasants west of the Ural Mountains. But ultimately, I think that we have the the democratization in Russia leads feels more like a head fake or a move in a direction, but really the czar moves back towards repression, and this seems to temporarily reduce the outward manifestation of social pressures, but actually, I would say that it magnifies and or multiplies the secret opposition, and so it seems very obvious to say that defeat in a war leads to social unrest, greater instability, and a loss of prestige for the centralized power. I think maybe the argument we can make about the Russo-Japanese War is it sets all of that in motion, but that a lot of that is hidden beneath the surface of a regime which is still very willing to use violence, imprisonment, and execution to maintain its power. And these tactics simply won't survive the disaster of the First World War. So I hope then that that gives you sort of three lenses of China, Japan, and Russia to look at those four lenses of politics, society, economics, and grand strategy. And of course, those are all mixed together. There are a bunch of things that might happen after wars that don't seem to happen. We don't have regime change in Russia. We don't have regime change in Japan. We don't have regime change in China. So comparing this with other wars, you're going to see that the political repercussions are less. These are not total wars, and it's not a particularly long war. So some of the economic shifts that we'll see, especially in later wars, increased power to workers and things like that don't really have time to take hold. And there isn't large scale shifting in the sorts of people who are working. So it's not that there's a huge increase in female employment, for example. So you can also contrast some of the changes which don't happen in these societies. And I think a lot of that has to do with the non-total nature of the war, and also its short duration. And most key, maybe of all, is that it's not fought in it's not fought in Japan, it's not fought in Russia, it's fought in Manchuria. And so those social repercussions, there's no sense in, well, there's not a strategy of the terrible treatment of civilians in Manchuria. Certainly civilians in Manchuria are exploited, but it's going to be to a much lesser degree than we'll see in subsequent wars, because the civilians around the war are not the obvious enemy. So when you try to come in and you try to do that comparison and contrast, just make sure you can compare and contrast what did happen. But I think you could also have at least a third of your thinking be about things that didn't happen when you're comparing it with a different war. And hopefully you have a good explanation of that.